Hello, everybody. I'm Keith Kirkpatrick, Research Director with the Futurum Group. I'd like to welcome you to Enterprising Insights, our weekly podcast that explores the latest developments in the enterprise software market and the technologies that underpin these platforms, applications, and tools. We're going to begin today by taking a deep dive into everyone's favorite topic, the use of generative AI within the enterprise. Next, we'll cover some recent news and newsmakers in the enterprise software market. Finally, we'll close out the show with our Rant or Rave segment, where we pick one item from the market or news around the market, and we'll either champion it or we'll criticize it. Now, I'd like to introduce my co-host for Enterprising Insights this week, Mark Beccue. Mark is a research director for artificial intelligence at the Futurum Group. He spent more than a decade covering artificial intelligence and those underlying technology approaches, including natural language processing, machine learning, deep learning, computer vision, and most recently, of course, LLMs and foundation models, which are powering today's generative AI offerings. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, Keith, how you doing?
I'm doing well. And yourself?
Very good.
Well, let's just get right into it, into our deep dive of the week here. And of course, this is this growing trend of enterprises starting to use generative AI and rolling them out into their platforms. Now, Mark, you've been covering this a long time, at least a decade, probably more. So if we can just jump back to, say, 2013, can you just give us a sense as to what the state of AI was back then in terms of its ability to provide meaningful real-world benefits to companies back then? Were there any, or was it all just kind of smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, it's a good question. There certainly was more than smoke and mirrors. And let's take a real quick jump back and say what really pushed that forward, right? You had AI's been around for a long time. People talk about AI being around for a long time. But what really changed in that time period, it really took off, like you said, 2013, 2014, 2015, was that compute got cheaper. And so you had, these scientists, data scientists were playing with models and thinking about things. And they were like, well, now this becomes more pragmatic and it moves out of the research lab and into, where we had companies actually operationalizing it. And if you look at the period we were at before we got to October, the Jubilee date of October of 2022 when ChatGPT showed up. But before that, you had a lot of companies operationalizing AI. And the most money was really spent in these use cases where you had some automation around customer service.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're going to talk a little more about that in a bit. But this idea that you could use automated agents to assist and move folks forward without necessarily a live agent being present. So that was one of them. Lots of things around predictive analytics. So, in matter of fact, a lot of people kind of refer to previously to generative AI as predictive AI, or predictive analytics AI was really the dominant piece to it.
Right.
So that's kind of where I think we started, and you had lots of investment in use cases going all the way up until October.
Right. So it's interesting. You're mentioning October of 2022, which is really just about a year ago. So what happened then, and why was it so, pardon the phrase, game changing for the market?
Right. It's fun to kind of, we're living in the middle of this such disruptive space. Right. So in October 2022, you had OpenAI introduce ChatGPT. And what was interesting to me was the way that people have talked about this differently. I've heard the wonderful explanation for this. This was the explanation, Keith. I love this. They said, we've had LLMs for a while. So GPT has been around, right? We've had it for a couple, 3 years for people talking about these deep learning models, big thing. But what we didn't have was this interface that was just a democratization of a deep learning model, right? So if you think about it, really the difference was to interact with a deep learning model, you had to be a data scientist before ChatGPT. What ChatGPT envisioned and it worked really well in concept was this idea that anybody can talk to a, a language model or an AI model, and it'll do something. So that
Right.
was what really changed the game. You had a couple other like AI foundation models come out around the same time. So it was Stability had one that's different. It's a diffusion model, those kinds of things. But that really changed the whole thing. It changed the whole idea. It's like all of a sudden there's this access to these massively smart, intelligent AI models, and that was the difference.
So what you're referring to is, you or I being able to go online, type in basically any type of a query as a prompt, and then get some sort of result, and we can talk later about whether or not it was true, accurate,
Yeah,
what have you.
yeah. It
Right.
was almost, think of it more as in the old days, and I'm old, so I can say this, but there was MS DOS and all those kind of computer languages, and you had to really learn. And before, if you
Yep.
think about the evolution of compute, what we had in the early days was somebody had to learn a specific language and programming to even get to talk to these very complex software programs.
Mhm.
That's that, and then we moved into a much better interface that worked for all sorts of us, so we could all do that. It's the same idea.
Right. Well, it seems like, this, I'm glad you brought that up because now, if we think about where we are right now, October 2023, now you have all of these SaaS vendors, whether we're talking about Salesforce, ServiceNow, Adobe, Oracle, whoever you want to name, they probably have something in their platform where they're going to say, hey, we are utilizing generative AI and we're rolling these tools out so that everyday, office productivity workers can now access this within their platform. So are you kind of surprised that they're rolling out this technology now when really, it hasn't been that long? And
Right. This is good because you and I have been messing around with this for a long time, and I will say that I think people miss some very important. You mentioned a few names there that I would call AI pioneers, right?
okay,
So, in my opinion, the few that you mentioned, specifically Adobe and Salesforce, have been invested in AI for almost 10 years. So they
hmm
were in on that early stage, right? They were in on predictive AI. They've been thinking about it. So in their case, these are companies that were ready to take advantage of generative AI because they understood all of the parameters and guardrails that you need for AI in general, right? So they were in a good place. They'd learned. And what's funny about that is when you operationalize AI, you got to think more like what's the life cycle of this stuff, right? It's got a different life cycle than software in many ways. So they learned all the ins and outs and were able to pounce on the generative when it started to come out. Some of those
right.
other companies you mentioned were, I guess I would call them more. They were thinking more like vendors, right? Like AI vendors. So Oracle is an AI vendor in many ways. Some
Mhm.
of the other guys, if we were to go back and look at those SaaS companies, I would say 9 times out of 10, most of them have been invested in AI for more than 3 or 4 years, easily. So
Mhm.
they're in the right place, right? Now, what you have now is everybody starting to talk about it, and we can talk about that, how that looks.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things when, we started hearing about generative AI in the popular press, one of the big topics that came up was the issue of hallucination, basically where you put in a prompt and, basically the model comes back because it's a mathematical model with, quite honestly, garbage.
Right.
And I guess the question is, with these SaaS platforms incorporating the technology, generative AI technology, how do they deal with those type of issues or toxicity or model bias? All of those things that, we're really being told right now are a big issue.
Right. So, you and I talked about this before, and we keep saying everybody has to remind themselves. So you just said it a couple minutes ago. It's not even been a year
hmm
that we just heard that Chat GPT just exploded into the, everybody's thinking about what it was. And I will tell you this: when before Chat GPT, I was talking to some companies that would really use a GPT, an LLM, right? So an LLM was something that existed before the interface, right? So I
Sure.
was talking to a company that was looking at this, and they went, well, you know, it, there's a lot of upside to an LLM. He said there's a lot of downside to an LLM. And this is where we go, right? So it's like,
Mhm.
well, what's the downside? It's ingesting so much information. Most of these the biggest ones we know of, the most popular ones, scrape the web. They scrape everything. So there's all this stuff, garbage in, garbage out.
Right. The good,
So
the bad,
what
the
happens is, right, lots of problems. You have it's eating information that's not good, right? So it's taking things that cause the model to think this is correct when it's misinformation.
Mhm.
Most of the LLMs can't really discern and do well with bias, right? They're not, because that's the data that they're eating. They're
Right.
seeing this data, they don't know. And I had a friend that said, it's kind of like a golden retriever. An LLM is kind of like a golden retriever. It'll go get anything.
Right.
Right? It's just you tell it to go. It's going to get. It's going to bring you an old sock and something that you wanted, but it's going to bring everything. Same
Right.
idea. And the
Right.
hallucination part is even that's really built into these models that just say, that, like I think you actually said it right. The way I would explain it is mathematically, this makes sense. And it
Right.
doesn't have the grounding to say, well, I'm not fact checking this. It's just this is the data set. And according to the data set, it's right.
Right. Mark, you just brought up a really great point about grounding. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that is and why it's important to figure out a way to make sure that these models don't just
Right.
like a golden retriever go out and bring back a dirty sock, an old
Dirty
tire
sock.
instead
Yeah.
of what you want.
Yeah. There's 3 or 4 different things that people are doing. And it's amazing because I use the word mutation. We've had a mutation happen since October, right? When you had they started coming out and people started going, well, maybe I should do this or maybe I should do that. So first would be you're seeing more specialized models come out. So some that aren't, and one of the way you'd address that would be, well, I'm not going to train it on so much data. Let's train it on a smaller data set that we're more confident in what's in there is good stuff, right? So
Sure.
that's one way to do it. So those are, let's call them slightly smaller large language models. I don't know. We don't have a name for it yet. So the other way would be that can you use the best of both worlds? So it's take a model and point it at data that you're confident in, right? So let's say it's you're a big enough enterprise that you have enough in a private domain that you can point it at that. So
Right.
say, well, let's look at that. So that's grounding, right? To your point, it's like, well, I know what's in there is okay. It's not going to be biased. It's not going to hallucinate because it's based on the data that's in there. That's another way. Sometimes people call that fine tuning.
Hmm.
You and I talked about this. I'm not sure if there's a really good name for it yet. It's sort of grounding. I don't know. So
We're
those are kind of
retraining, a lot of different names.
retraining. Yeah.
So is that where, just as by way of an example, so that would be, let's say I'm a Salesforce and I'm trying to use generative AI and I'm saying, well, I don't want my chatbot to go out and just grab any old answer. I want to make sure that it only uses our vetted, company knowledge base, for answers. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yeah. And there's a trick to that. It's really, I think that Salesforce was one of the first companies that said they were going to do that, right? So
Mhm.
they and no, there's no owner's manual for LLM as far as I know. Like, oh, you can do this. Well, they figured that out. So that was a good idea, and I think they meet a lot of the criteria that would make sense for somebody to go ahead and do that right
Mhm.
now. Is because they have so much data that they
Yeah.
can that they can take they can protect it, they can make sure it's normalized and anonymized and those kinds of things.
Mhm.
So it made sense, and that's really something we talk about a lot with customers is if you have a lot of data that's readable, you should think about AI because that if you can do that, that brings value to the table in what you're trying to do.
Right, right. It's interesting when you bring up Salesforce, and it is they are a company that seems to be going about deploying a generative AI in the right room. I think you have a sort of a series of articles or research notes called Adults in the Generative AI Rumpus Room, which I think is a great
Yes.
title, by the way. So, what is it that they're doing right, and what is it that whether we're talking vendors or even enterprises that are looking to deploy generative AI, what do they need to
Yeah.
look out for?
Yeah, I love that. What's funny is I'm finding more and more that our advice, and you've been in on this, the advice to companies is make sure you're paying attention to what you learn in business school
Hmm.
and a business discipline, right? So it's really very constructive to think, do I want to do, and this is what Salesforce did. They said, we have an issue we're trying to solve. What would be a way to solve it? Right. So
Hmm.
they didn't say, "Oh, we need some AI. I want to go do it." That's kind of flavor of the month, right? No, they said,
Right.
"Well, we think that AI can help us with some of the things that we do." Right. So they went through a process and they said, "All right, so here's something it can do. We're going to figure out how to use it. Then we're going to, as you do that, you understand more and more what its pros and cons are." And you'll
Hmm.
say, "Oh, that helps me understand processes and people, these very soft things that you need to run AI. It's not really technical. It's got to
Right.
do with these,
Or
policies you might have, right? So better data management, better data governance. How do
mhm.
I use it?" So they have something that they've pioneered that we really push out to a lot of people. It's called uh, the tenets of responsible AI. Do I,
Mhm.
you ask yourself these questions about the use case, right? You'd say, does this meet the criteria for privacy, accuracy, all of the bias, all those things that you ask it to do? They figured that out. And so I think that really it goes back to a company with a lot of experience is these guys that have worked with AI for a while. They figured it out the hard way, and
Mhm.
you can't shortcut it. It's really not easy to shortcut it. And what's interesting is those same principles that we just talked about, those apply to, let's call it predictive AI before you get to generative AI. So it doesn't change. Matter of fact, it just amplifies it, right? So
Right.
so you're taking the principles you had that you already had in place that these companies did, and they're just applying it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess that's, the big issue here. It sounds like it's not necessarily about the technology. It's about, as you mentioned, you know, looking at your people, looking at your processes, you know, and making sure that they're, set up properly before you even think about the technology as the solution.
What problem are you trying to solve?
Right.
What problem are you trying to solve? It sounds simple, but that's really the where you start, right? And think about, oh, okay, maybe that'll help, maybe it won't. One of the things I think Salesforce, and we talked about others like Adobe, they've actually
Mhm.
said, what problem do I want to solve? And they're saying, and this is really goes to innovation, right? How you think about technology innovation, what you're dealing with these companies that are very bright that do
Yep.
this is they're not saying it's one thing or another, right? They're saying, I don't care what technology solves the
Right.
problem. I'm not going to be biased in that sense. So maybe it's AI, maybe it didn't, maybe it's something else.
Mhm. Right, right. Well, that seems like a prudent approach because, again, getting back to the other point you made there about looking at even the selection of different LLMs.
Mm.
Why use one over another? Well, you have to look at the problem that you're trying to solve and then worry about which model you might be used and how you might use it.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing in this mutation is people are not it's not a marriage, right? You're kind of dating LLMs, and I think there's gonna be a lot of dating of LLMs and no real long-term commitments to one or another because of exactly what you said. We're getting these different flavors. One might make better sense for certain use cases that you have versus another. And
Right,
so we're seeing a lot of, I'm going to use this one. I'm going to use this one. It's kind of like getting a cloud provider too.
right, right. Well, thanks very much for your insights, Mark. There's certainly a lot going on in the world. right now, and it's only going to continue. But what I'd like to do right now is just take a look at some of the news in the market over the past week or so and get your thoughts on it. These are all sort of related to generative AI, so just sit tight. So, one thing that we saw recently is that Oracle announced on September 19th that they have integrated generative AI powered capabilities within their Oracle Fusion Cloud customer experience offering. The interesting thing here is they mentioned several use cases. I think assisted agent responses, assisted knowledge articles, customer engagement summaries, guidance for content creation. But the thing that really was interesting to me was the use of generative AI to help out field service professionals and providing recommendations. And what I think they're getting at here is, let's say you have a appliance repair person coming out to your house, and he is trying to figure out which way to put in a certain part. I think the goal here is to be able to make it easy for him to say, hey, which way should this part go in, and not have to go through a 50-page manual. Are use cases like that? Is that where you see a real value in that it really does actually save people time, as opposed to sort of just a lot of what these other vendors are saying is, hey, we can get it, we can save you 10 minutes from writing an email or something like that.
Right. Well, I like what you said about Oracle is very bright in AI. I think they're pragmatic. That's another word. They're an adult in the rumpus room.
Yep.
Interestingly, if you notice that list, they didn't have automated agent, right? They didn't have a lot of that. You and I have talked about that so much. But they were using it in an assisted way, right? You're thinking about human in the loop kinds of things. So, I think that they're understanding the low hanging fruit of generative AI is in these all of those things you mentioned kind of bring in the strengths of that, right? Whereas you avoid the I'm going to handle it directly, customer service things. That's something we've been working on for years and still not solved exactly, but we're getting there, right?
Yeah.
The field agent thing is interesting because what most people want to add to that is computer vision
Hmm.
ideas. So I'll be interested to see where that goes. And there's certainly generative AI in the computer vision space
Right.
as well. But it's like, well, if I could show you a picture of this and then pops up and shows me, here's what that part looks like and where you should put it, that's been on the table for a while. So maybe that gets solved.
Right. Well, the other thing that I found really interesting is, I guess a couple months back, I saw a paper that had been published by researchers at MIT, Sloan, and Stanford. And they basically looked at the use of a generative AI tool in the contact center. And the really
Mm-hmm.
interesting thing was they found out that, you know, yes, using generative AI can save time. It can make these agents' life a little bit easier. But really, the productivity gains were the highest among new workers. And I think there's something to be said for that. We really have to, or organizations are going to have to look and see, where does generative AI make the most sense? Because, and this is something I think you alluded to before, compute isn't free. You can't just
Right.
go out and deploy this everywhere because, it's expensive.
Right. It is. We don't know, being in the early stages of this and my coverage, we're looking at these investments and what these LLMs are going to spend on training being one side of the equation, on inference being the other, is substantial. And, while you have a lot of unicorn companies showing up and a lot of this positioning going on, what we really don't have, and we'll go back to our, when we talk about business disciplines and things like that, is what's the COGS, right? What's the cost?
Yeah.
We don't really know. And companies are pretty good about going, okay, I'm going to try and figure this out. But
Right.
all that has to line up pretty well. It's like, so who they're getting the LLM from is going to say, all right, well, here's a contract, but it's open ended, or how much am I going to charge, or you have to go you have to go run this in your own data center. That kind of thing is still it's formative, right? We're working
Yep.
on those.
Right. Is it your sense that this is something that's going to be changing over time? We're not going
It
to see
has
the
to.
same pricing. Yeah.
It has to, right?
Yeah.
There's so much emphasis right now on how much pressure AI is putting on compute.
Yeah.
That there's a ton. I mean, if I were, well, I am an investor, but I mean, if you were investing in things, you're thinking about all these different, again, mutations. So here's the LLMs coming out. Now we're getting this kind of cottage industry of, well, this runs the models more efficiently. And here are new chips, because we don't have chips that actually were designed to run AI workloads. It just
Mm-hmm.
so happened that GPUs work pretty well, right?
Right.
So now you have this race in chips. And all of a sudden because you have to push the price down or the cost down of compute, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see how this all sorts out for, what it costs people. I mean, we had Microsoft come out and say, Copilot's going to cost $30 a seat,
Right.
enterprise. Okay. That's at least that's a stake in the ground. Let's see what happens, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, it's interesting. The other another piece of news that I wanted to bring up here is ServiceNow, which is, I believe, another one of the adults in the rumpus room there. They actually announced several major enhancements within their Now Assist family of solutions in their next release, which is the Now Platform Vancouver release.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the really interesting thing, aside from the fact that they're deploying generative AI across all of these different workflows, is they claim, it seems like they're really claiming first mover advantage in terms of making all of this technology generally available, not just in pilot, it's available for anyone to use. Is first mover advantage, is that even important given the fact that, like you said, we're still in the early days and things are going to change?
No, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Right.
that, people go to ServiceNow because they have a very specific thing they're trying to do, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is what we do. It's like, well, I have AI now. It's like, that's nice. Did it make what you do for me better?
Right.
If it does, then fantastic, right? And if it doesn't, it doesn't help. But they, so what you have is a classic marketing people talking sometimes, and it's like at the end of the day, we encourage our clients and tell them what it'll do.
Yep.
Why is this better? Why am I making your life better? Now, that said, let's say some of these SaaS companies you mentioned are kind of, I don't want to say morphing into, like, let's call it low code platforms. So
Right.
they're kind of saying these things to their customers who tweak stuff, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just embedded AI in the SaaS that I get and I'm just going to go do this. It's
Right.
kind of more like, well, I have something that you can make a little better if you're, and I get the sense that most Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies do tweak a lot of these SaaS platform applications for their own use. So that would be logical to say, okay, maybe that does help a little bit.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And then the final piece of news I wanted to get to, and this is somewhat related, Sugar CRM, which is a CRM vendor, they just released the results of a survey that I found was pretty interesting. They surveyed about 800 global, sales folks, marketing people, IT leaders, so forth, and they're trying to understand the different or the shifting use cases for CRM over the past 5 years, given that everything we've gone through, from the pandemic to economic uncertainty and whatnot. One of the really interesting things that came out of that is that they are saying that a lot of these folks still feel that CRM doesn't have the capability or doesn't have the features that it needs to really provide much more value, and they're looking to generative AI to help that. And my question to you is, isn't that kind of missing the point? When we're focusing on generative AI, isn't it really about, again, defining the problem and figuring out the solution, and then, hey, if generative AI is the way to go, great. But if you can do it another way,
Right.
well, take it that way.
Yeah, it seems a little vague if you were to say, my productivity is better or worse. What were they actually saying about that CRM problem, right? They weren't being very specific, but
Right.
we do know that if you just took the generative AI use cases and said, it seems that the argument for, let's say, text summarization. So I heard one that actually was pretty cool. So
Okay.
let's say you're on a call right? A sales call or any call, we're on all these different business calls,
Sure.
and the assistant takes the meeting notes.
Yep.
So, and we've been doing this for years, but it's transcribed immediately. So generative AI can do that, right?
Right.
So now you have a record immediately available that is a accurate record of that meeting. And I've heard some instances where this was actually last week. I heard this from an enterprise that was doing this. It's like, there's no question when you got 4 people on a call and the transcription says this, right? It's not
Right.
it's not open to interpretation. So
Right.
you had some synergies. That's CRM, right? So that's synergy to say, hey, we just saved some time because we're not arguing about who's heard what in a different
Right.
way. This is what we said. And take those notes and move them into something quicker. I can put this into other content very quickly. So
Right.
you can see, I would kind of put it this way, Keith. Think about where we are right now. We have a couple things going on. One would be a massive paradigm shift.
Sure.
And think of it as, I like to think of it as, when we first got the iPhone and there was the App Store, and when we have taco bots and different stupid things that people came up with, it's like, this is what we can make with and then you had people really thinking about how to apply it, and it got sharp, right? We've got mobile apps now that just are beyond comprehension. I never even thought we'd be like, oh, well, we can. You got on a plane last week, and I'm like, I don't have paper. I completely, boom, phone, done. All of these things that we just, it takes time for all of those logical things to come out and go. The other part is education process, man. So that is, you got people coming up with innovation. Now you're going to have people thinking about how they use these interfaces and all this kind of how they're going to use an LLM. And we're going to be prompt engineers, all of us.
Yeah.
We're all going to be, if we don't ask it right, it's not going to give us what we want. So I know that's kind of off the subject, but that's really where these people, think about those things.
Isn't that also one of the goals of some of these platforms, is to help folks construct platforms or prompts, excuse me, so they are asking the right thing without, going in circles.
We're just getting to that. Yeah, we're just getting to that. There's an education process, and it's on, you think who's got something to lose there is whoever's putting that out to say, well, you need to use this. It's like, oh, well, I have a magic, all those different things that Oracle said. Well, does it come with an instruction manual, or how do I use this? What's the best way for me to use this? It behooves Oracle to make sure they're telling people, by the way, you might want to ask it this way, or you might want to do, just kind of bullet point things that teach people how to maximize what they're doing, because they're not going to know. And then they may get frustrated and just put it aside. I like to think of one other part that you're going to laugh about, but there's all these bells and whistles people talk about, and they're like, well, you can do this and you can do this. And I'm thinking VCR clock, right? Did you ever set a VCR clock? Does anybody know how to do that? Is it there? Or is this feature? Yeah. I never knew how to do it. I don't care. It just went away. And it's like, it was a great feature. No, I never used it. So we're going to have to teach people.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, thank you for your insights, Mark. Now I'd like to get to the last part of our show here, which is the rant or rave of the week. And what I'd like to do is give you a topic, and you can either choose to rant or rave about it. And I'll just throw this out there. We talked about it a little bit before about SaaS platforms allowing enterprise customers to bring their own LLM into their platform and use that. Is that something that is a smart strategy? Is it something that is introducing a host of other issues, or what's your thought there?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it falls into rant or rave. I'm kind of a new. I'm gonna call Switzerland on that and say,
sitting on the fence.
Sit in the middle. I think the reason you're seeing that is because we're at this point where you're at the beginning of these how all this stuff's coming out, and nobody wants to be married, right? You're not making a big long commitment. You're kind of like, we're dating, we're just dating, we're dating casually, we're not even going to, think about this for any other reason. But so I think that is smart on the behalf of the companies that say bring your own model,
Okay.
because there's a lot of it. I mean, it's a mutation. It literally is a mutation. There's a ton of really interesting stuff happening, and then you have some. There's some friction between private and open source as well. So
Sure.
you have lots of enterprises that say, I'm only doing open source, or I'm only doing it the other way, or those kinds of things. So it gives enterprises a lot of flexibility. Maybe I'd lean towards a Rave, I guess, a
Okay.
little more than it's not certainly not a Rant, but it's not a
Okay.
strong Rave.
All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for joining me here on Enterprising Insights. Next time, we're going to be discussing the growing use of low code and no code platforms, something we touched on a little bit today within the enterprise. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your preferred platform. We'll see you next week.